think. No? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Bonjour. May I ask people to take their seats, please? We're just about to begin, and we appreciate your patience. Thank you. Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the ILO. I'm Deborah Greenfield, Deputy Director-General for Policy here, and I'm pleased to be the first person to welcome you officially to this global policy dialogue on the future of work we want. I especially want to welcome those of you who've traveled to Geneva to be with us today. I also know that there are people in our overflow rooms and people watching remotely, so welcome to everyone. Our audience today includes government representatives, representatives of employers and workers organizations, international organizations, researchers from academia and think tanks, as well as individuals who simply want to steep themselves in the crucial and complicated topic called the future of work. Over the next 2 days, we're going to explore a number of aspects of the future of work that can guide us in shaping the future that we want and in helping the ILO advance its mission of social justice. So before the program starts, I want to orient you to its design and flow. First, we'll begin with remarks from our Director General, Guy Ryder, who will also introduce our keynote speaker, Robert Skidelsky. After Lord Skidelsky's keynote, we're going to move into 5 sessions over the course of the 2 days. You'll hear more from our Director General in a minute about the architecture of the sessions, which tracks the way we at the ILO have been thinking about the future of work and its implications for economic, employment, and social policy. Second, as many of you, but perhaps not all of you know, the ILO rests on a foundation of social dialogue. We make decisions through the involvement of employers, workers, and governments. And we believe, and our Constitution tells us, that labor and employment issues need to be solved through social dialogue at national, regional, and international levels. Our commitment to social dialogue also explains another key feature of this event. We've involved discussants in each panel who represent workers and employers, and they will provide reactions after each session because their voices are indispensable in developing policies that will shape the future of work. Third, each session will have simultaneous interpretation in English, French, and Spanish, so please use the headsets provided. Finally, since this is all about the future of work, we have a dynamic way for you to ask questions. As explained on this screen and in your packets, we're using a mobile system called Slido that you can use to ask our panelists questions, take part in interactive polls, see what people are saying on social media, and even consult the agenda. You should all have received an email with instructions on how to use it. But if you can't find that email, our moderator will give us a brief walkthrough in just a few moments. And because this is all about the future and the future of work, we have a fifth session in which we will hear the voices of young people to hear what they expect and want from the future of work. And now I'd like to get started with the program. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce someone who really doesn't need any introduction, the ILO's Director-General, Guy Ryder.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Good morning to all of you, and thank you for joining us this morning at the ILO for what we consider to be an extraordinarily important event. Let me set the scene of this room for you. Normally this is a room where governments sit in the middle, employers sit over here, workers sit over there, and they try to reach agreement, usually, adopt a resolution, adopt conclusions on difficult subjects. You are not required to do anything so difficult as adopting resolutions or reaching conclusions. That's the good news. The bad news, or I don't think it's bad news, the challenging news, is that you're asked to address an issue of overwhelming complexity, the future of work, but an issue which I think we will all agree is absolutely fundamental to the circumstances in which we live. If we look at our communities, if we look at the economics of our time, the social tensions of our time, if we look at the politics of today, we know that many of the moving issues are those connected to the evolution of the world of work and the future of work that we wish to construct together. And that is why the ILO has taken advantage of the occasion of its centenary in 2 years' time to launch its centenary initiative on the future of work. I think this is an initiative which brings together the needs of our circumstances, with opportunity, the opportunity of our centenary to put some important questions on the table and hopefully produce some answers. Over the last year or more, our member states, the overwhelming majority of them, have engaged in national dialogues on the future of work, generally on a tripartite basis. And these dialogues have been extraordinarily encouraging, both in terms of the results they have produced and in terms of the ownership that our member states have taken of this issue of the future of work. The second stage after these national dialogues will be the work of a high-level global commission on the future of work, which we will establish later in the year. And that, in turn, will report to our centenary conference in June 2019, the culminating point of this Future of Work initiative. Let me just say very few words on the way we have tried to structure these dialogues, to structure this initiative. We have launched what we call 4 conversations. Let me just enumerate them for you. The first is on a subject which, whilst I believe it to be crucial to the overall endeavour, is not given the attention it deserves. It's a question of work and society. What is the meaning, the socialising function of work? How is the changing nature of work acting upon the manners in which societies cohere or do not cohere? I think we're all very conscious of the fact that work is being diversified, work is being undertaken in a sometimes bewildering variety of settings. This does not have only economic consequences. I believe that it has important consequences for the way the individual relates to society. Sigmund Freud it was who said that work is the individual's connection with reality. And we all know what happens, I think, when that connection is broken or attenuated. So let's think about these issues of the meaning of work. Secondly, we're going to address the most frequently asked questions. Where will the jobs come from, the jobs of tomorrow, and what will they look like? Many of you in this room are very well aware that the international community, through the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, has already committed itself to creating full employment and decent work for all by 2030. Nobody can doubt that was a very courageous objective. Was it a wise one? Was it a foolish one? Is it one we take seriously? But if so, we have to work out what the jobs of the future will look like, where they're coming from, and what we're going to do to shape them. The third conversation is about the organization of work and production. Yes, work is being diversified, but what of the employment relationship? Will the employer-employee relationship, which has been the institutional backdrop of everything the ILO has done for nearly a century, will that be the defining, organizing feature of the future of work, or are we going into new territory where work no longer becomes mediated through a labor relationship, but more through a commercial relationship? And when we look at the emergence of the platform economy, when we look at the diversification of contractual forms, major questions of this nature arise. And I would refer here also to the whole question of the appearance of increasingly fragmented and complex global supply chains, which is a source of great debate here at the ILO. And the fourth conversation, and in a sense it is the natural consequence of the preceding three, is the governance of work. You know, the founders of the ILO, when they created this organization nearly 100 years ago, said, and it's in the preamble of our Constitution, that they were moved by considerations of humanity, social justice, and the preservation of peace. Three principles that should not be lost from view as we consider the future of work and how we intend to govern it. And the last point I want to make to you, and it's the overwhelmingly important one in my mind, is that if we're coming here together to talk about the future of work, it is not as spectators, it is not spectators to a natural or inevitable evolution of the world of work. It is actors. We are here as actors. It is through human agency, not simply the forces of technology or of globalization or any other, that the future of work will be forged. And it's your human agency today that can contribute enormously to the success of our initiative and to this overwhelmingly important task of forging the future of work that we want. My job now is to get out of the way and leave the floor to others who will speak more expertly than I on the subject. And it is a matter of great pride that I'm going to introduce our special guest speaker, Lord Skidelsky. Robert, you are very welcome here. You need little introduction. For those of us who have your trilogy of John Maynard Keynes on our bookshelves, we know that you are intimately knowledgeable about the circumstances which led to the creation of the International Labour Organization. And your illustrious academic career, which has taken you from Europe to America and back again, has not stopped you from remaining a friend and actor in this organization. You're a member of our research review group. We thank you for being here. We look forward eagerly to the comments that you have to make, and I offer you the floor. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for those words and for asking me. It's to come here today. The place of human work in societies is one which is increasingly compelling to discuss. That is, in human societies which are becoming automated. In fact, the subject is no less than what is the human race going to do when its primary historical occupation, to labor by the sweat of the brow for its living, is removed because mechanical slaves will be available to do most of the laboring. That's the long-term question. It's evident, I think, that all our social, moral, and psychological structures based on the necessity to work will come under severe challenge. We'll have to ask increasingly whether they're fit for purpose when the purpose is no longer as it was when they were set up. And it's at least arguable that for the last 40 years, rich countries have found a way of postponing the day of reckoning by relentlessly striving to make themselves even richer than they are, while the rest of the world is still engaged in trying to catch up with them. That's to say, we in the West have been trying to meet the challenges of abundance and automation, not by developing new forms of work or alternative goals of life, but by aiming for more of the same. Our true religion continues to be the continuous growth of wealth as defined by gross domestic product. Because if the output of goods and services can be kept growing, there will continue to be enough demand for human work to provide tolerably full employment. I mean, that's the way the argument goes. But this, I suggest, is a postponement. And one achieved at the cost of increasing tension between the demand for goods and the productive capacity of society, one that's already was brought to light in the Great Recession, and we can see the tensions that creates. The ILO should be congratulated, I think, on making the future of work the subject of its centenary conversations, because there's nothing more important, really, than a topic that exists to be having a conversation about. And so I look forward to 2 days of exciting thinking. Now, why has it become a matter of compelling interest? Not just because of the lingering unemployment from the Great Recession, but because of fear that automation will hugely reduce the number of jobs available in the future. You can't open a newspaper today without reading a story of robots taking over human work. So it's not stretching the imagination too far to see a workless future for many entering the labor market today. A workless future in the next increasingly workless future in the next 20 or 30 years. How realistic is that? Ever since the Luddites in the early 19th century, people have feared that machines would take over human jobs, creating permanent and increasing technological unemployment. It's never happened yet. Technological progress has created more jobs, new products, and the demand for new products. Is it different this time? Well, I think it is, because digital technology has carried the intrusion of machines into the world of human work to a much higher level than ever in the past. It's not just physical work that is being lost, but what one might call cognitive work. It's penetrated into areas of work which was considered to be the exclusive preserve of human beings because of their unique cognitive abilities. But artificial intelligence has really undermined that premise. And in their book, The New Machine Age, Brynjolfsson and McAfee have argued that it's now going to be a race between machines and humans, a race which they suggest humans may well lose. I don't like the language of races, because races are meant to end at some point, but this race goes on forever. And so they think in the end, unless we really manage to do something pretty drastic, the future will consist of what they call lovely jobs at the top, for ballet dancers and sort of people in the arts, and lousy jobs at the bottom, and everything in between will be automated. And two academics, Frey and Osborne, say that 47% of existing American jobs can now be automated technologically, and then it's just a matter of time before they actually are. But now strip away the science fiction. In sober terms, technological progress simply means that less work is needed to produce a unit of output. People, therefore, can choose either to work fewer hours for the same output or the same hours for more output. This choice is opening up. And just to be intrude a moment of technical analysis, economists distinguish between two effects, which they call the substitution effect and the income effect. So, the substitution effect, if wages increase, then work becomes relatively more profitable than leisure. Because it means that workers can actually have access to more and more goods. So on that sort of line of argument, workers will give up leisure to do more work as their incomes rise. But there's another effect which people consider, that as they become richer, they'll have to work less, and therefore they'll give up work for leisure. Now, it was assumed until recently that the second effect would predominate as societies became richer. That as they became richer, they would tend to give up work because they could get what they wanted for less effort. And that was certainly the assumption of John Maynard Keynes in a book, a little essay he wrote in 1930 called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, where he sort of, in a way, looked forward to a time, not too far distant, when hours of work would be dropping towards zero, actually, in time. Now, in a way, we've seen some of that effect, because in the last 100 years, up to about 1980, hours of work steadily dropped from a peak of about 60 hours a week in 1880 to about 40, just under 40 hours a week in 1880 to 90. But since 1980, they've stopped dropping. They seem to have hit a barrier to fall of about 40 hours a week on average. And somehow we don't get below that. Why? Why is that? Well, I think there are four possible answers. At least I can think of four possible answers. Maybe you'll think of others as well. But one is because perhaps people think of work not as a cost, but a benefit, as giving form, completeness, and purpose to their lives. They can't face the thought of having acres of unstructured time. As the ILO Research Department puts it in their introduction to these conversations, work became, in the last 100 years, not only a means to material fulfillment, but also a fundamental tool for personal development and community participation. So work has become more meaningful over time. Now, I'm not sure that historically is quite right, but let's at any rate say that this could be an important reason why people cling to work, don't want to give it up. Secondly, the failure of hours of work to fall may be due to our innate insatiability. That is something economists, especially American economists, are very keen on. People want more and more goods, so they work longer in order to get them. In this view, work is still a cost, but the pain of working less is less than the pain of giving up. The pain of working is less than the pain of giving up the goods one could get by going on working. So they're making that kind of trade-off. Insatiability, we've got to think about insatiability. Is it innate? Is it something that sort of entered human history or was released fairly late in human history? Insatiable for what? All these questions are really begged by the notion of insatiability, yet insatiability defines modern economics. In its famous definition, economics is the study of limitless wants in relation to limited resources. That is the definition of economics. So insatiability is built in to the definition of the subject and therefore dictates the way economics thinks about the economic problem. A third reason why hours of work may not have fallen as much as we expected is that, in fact, workers don't choose how much to work, as employers make out, as economists make out. It is employers who choose how much they work. So how much people work measures not their preferences, but the structure of power in the labor market. I mean, that's a very important point to bear in mind, because this language of voluntary choices simply ignores social structures. It's employers who determine earnings, hours, and conditions of work. That's still true for the majority, and it's even though there's much more self-employment and so on, but basically that is still how the labor market is structured. And such limited power as workers and governments did have 40 or 50 years ago over these matters has been eroded by the dismantling of trade unions, the deregulation of labor markets, globalization, financialization, and much else. In other words, it's a myth to say that the hours most people work reflect voluntary choices between work and leisure. All the survey material we have suggests that people would prefer to work less, most people. That's all the survey material. Whenever asked this question, they would give that answer. But there is a proviso, provided they don't suffer fall in their income. And that's very, very important. So the issue of power in the labor market is something I think that's going to be considered in the third session. But it is a very important one. And finally, average hours of work is heavily determined by the distribution of income. The increase in average real earnings since the 1980s has disguised a stagnation or even fall in median wages, leaving the typical earner no better off than he or she was 30 or 40 years ago. Even worse off in some respects. In other words, the substitution effect, the fact that people, when they get richer, will go on working because they want more goods and services, is largely a myth. That's not the reason why they go on working more and more, because increasing incomes increase the desire for goods. They go on working long hours because they need to just keep running to stay in the same place. In the United Kingdom, for example, 12 million people live below the officially defined poverty line. 12 million people. Well, that's a fifth of the population. And it's a very high percentage. Growing poverty in the midst of plenty would itself tend to raise the average of hours work. And in fact, since the Great Recession, and also since the method of recovery from the Great Recession, that is quantitative easing, monetary easing has been in place, inequality has grown because most of the new money has gone to those who already own assets. They're the ones who have sold their assets to get hold of the cash. And so inequality has grown in the last 8, 9, 10 years as part of the only recovery mechanism that Draghi and Bernanke and others have been able to think of in the light of the crash of 2008. And David Harvey has written, "Work does not hold a tendency to vanishing, rather to grow together with unemployment in a mixture of insecurity and marginalization." Now, these are questions which will require deeper analysis than I can give them here, but there'll be an opportunity to think about these things in the next couple of days. One observation which I think requires more scrutiny, is that over the whole of their lives, people do work less than they used to, and less than suggested by a 40-hour week. In other words, the 40-hour week is compressed into a shorter working life than in the past at both ends. In other words, young people stay in education several years longer than they used to, and retirees enjoy many more years of not working. So over the whole of their lives, people do less work than they used to. And this is the fruit of both technology and social policy. So the world as a whole the world of work is already shrinking. It has been shrinking gradually over the last 100 years, and automation will just accelerate that shrinkage. So that's something we need to think about. Secondly, are people as insatiable as economists make them out to be? Insatiable, that is, for consumption goods. I don't think so. I think this attempt to derive economic outcomes from some so-called primary human psychological traits is very, very misguided. Humans are capable of many they have many potentialities. And how those potentialities express themselves is, to a large extent, the function of the way society is structured. They are situated today, human beings, in economies which fuel insatiability through relentless advertising. Advertising is a feature of market power which economists, Chicago economists particularly, relentlessly ignore. As a result, many people can't imagine a future whose main source of satisfaction will not be ever-increasing quantities and varieties of consumption goods. Other aims in life have atrophied through not being sufficiently brought to people's attention. Education is still, in general, geared to fitting people for the job market, a job market which is shrinking before their eyes. Hence, of course, growing youth unemployment. Now, all these things we need to think more about. We also need to sort out what we mean by work and leisure. I use that distinction with my son in our book, a book we wrote recently called How Much Is Enough, but I don't think it's satisfactory, since we mean by work, normally, working for a living, and we mean by leisure, normally, doing nothing. Now, that can't be right. There are so many different varieties of work. My assumption is now that most people will want to contribute something to the community, insofar as their abilities and interests are structured. And ways will have to be found to enable them to do that outside the current job market. Now, there's a big topic here. I don't want to go into it. Women's work is obviously one of the important issues. Even today, I think, many people do enjoy the jobs they do, or the status and satisfaction that being an earning member of the community brings, and they will be very, very upset if that is removed and they're told, well, we don't need you anymore. You're actually redundant to requirements. The human race is redundant. Now, people don't like that thought, and they will do everything possible to avert it. And we've got to find ways of making it possible to move into a future in which there will be work, rewarding work for most people to do of some kind. However, let's put these more fundamental questions to one side for the moment and concentrate on one thing. Let's assume that the situation which Keynes foresaw in 1930, that people will now be, on average, not have to work more than 15 hours a week, becomes a reality. In short, that what we now think of as full employment will be a 15-hour work week without loss of income. And wouldn't that be a good outcome? If automation was able to produce that, wouldn't that be a good thing? Well, what would we need to do to make it a good thing? A number of policy alternatives. I want to just end my remarks by considering a few of these. Suggest themselves. One thing I feel sure about is we can't just leave it to the market. In neoclassical economics, there's no case at all for interfering between individual choices between work and leisure. And the argument is that automation will further reduce the cost of producing goods and services. I mean, that's what technological progress means. So that will automatically lead to an increase in real incomes for the population without us having to worry about anything. In other words, real incomes will grow not because money wages continue to expand. We don't need unions. They'll grow as an automatic consequence of things costing less. Therefore, there is no point of intervening. Workers will be in a position to trade off continuing income growth for increasing leisure, and there's no reason why the unemployment rate should rise. I mean, that is the neoclassical view. So the process will continue perfectly smoothly through market self-regulation. But this is a completely fictional picture of this frictionless transition to shorter working. Most people are not free to choose their optimal mix of work and leisure. Some will choose to work less, some to work more. Others will be forced to work ever longer hours at lower wages as a cheap labor alternative to machines. Others will be forced into unemployment. Even if we assume, which is by no means clear, that automation will create sufficient replacement jobs or complementary jobs in time, there's still a huge transitional problem. Now, if we then aim to maintain full employment on the basis of shorter hours, we can think of different market interventions. One of them, very frequently discussed recently, has been to tax the cost, tax robots, to raise the cost of installing robots relative to the cost of employing labor. And this is one of two valid reasons, I think, two reasons for taxing the use of robots. And I was quite interested in this. A couple of years ago, I proposed what I call a selective employment tax. Employers would be charged a payroll tax on all units of labor in their plant, but human labor would be taxed at a lower rate than robot labor. There are problems with that, big problems. I mean, they're legion, the problems with that, but some of them are that this would work perfectly well, perhaps where discrete robotic operations could be identified. In other words, automatic checkout points in shops, or robotized stock picking lines, as Walmart and Amazon are doing. They're replacing human stock pickers by machines whose hands sort of reach out and grab things that people have ordered and then wheel them along to the dispatch point. I mean, there you can say, okay, there's a clear substitution of robotic for human labor. Let's tax the use of those mechanical arms and give humans a chance. The idea would be to slow down the rate of automation. But the trouble is that you can't draw the line in many cases. If artificial intelligence is bundled up with other machinery, how can you separate the artificial intelligent component and tax that? Because if you tried to do that, what would soon happen is that you'd just be imposing a tax on capital investment in general, and that may not be a good thing. It may be a good thing. It may not be a good thing. But that's something that another argument for taxing robots is to create a fund for supporting or training workers rendered redundant or underemployed by robotization. However, You know, again, there are problems with that. You don't want to limit the fund by taxing its source. You actually want to increase the fund, and taxing robots isn't the right way of doing it. You know, what you should do is to have a general tax rather than a tax on robots specifically. So these are objections to taxing robots. A lot more can be said. I rather favor it. I mean, humans should be given a bit of a chance in this race if we're committed to the race metaphor. And taxing the use of robots is an attractive way of tilting the playing field a bit more towards human labor in the transition period, so that it's not too wrenching. Now we come to proposals for a citizen's income. Again, a variety of aims lie behind this, of which providing an income to replace earnings for work is only one of the aims. Remember, citizens' income has a very long history. It's been adapted now to the problem of automation and how to deal with it. But its roots go back a lot further. Now, one version, which we owe to the economist James Mead, and he first proposed this in the 1960s, is to provide all citizens with a dividend from the growth of the economy. The main idea is that all citizens are in some senses shareholders in an economy, their labor constituting a share, which is not adequately compensated by their wages. This, of course, so it needs to be compensated by dividend payments. If wages adequately compensated them for their contribution to the growth of the economy, then you wouldn't want an additional dividend. But of course, the argument that workers are paid their marginal product, which is, of course, a standard neoclassical argument, is highly flawed. They're not. Their wages depend on the bargaining power in the market, not in some automatic way on their contribution. So dividend, to give them a dividend, seems to be a way of compensating for inequality of power in the labor market. But of course, this raises highly contentious issues concerning the justice of distribution, which is ignored by neoclassical economics, and I won't go any further into it. To my mind, you could do something good here. A feasible version of the dividend proposal would be to set up a national investment bank, capitalized by the taxpayer, which would be mandated to make investments yielding both a private and a social rate of return. Part of this would be reinvested in growth, part of it distributed to its shareholders, the taxpayers, as dividend payments. Now, I think this is interesting development we could think about. The rationale for such a public investment function was stated by Adam Smith, actually, in The Wealth of Nations. It's been ignored by most of his followers. And that is that there are certain investments, and Adam Smith was thinking mainly of infrastructure investments, but you can, of course, extend what he meant by infrastructure, would benefit the economy, whose length of gestation and scale and risk is too great for private enterprise. And that gives the state an public investment function. Neoclassical economics ignores this completely. It regards all state expenditure as wasteful. All of it. Some of it necessary evil, because you have to have a police force and so on. But most of it as wasteful. That, of course, idea was behind the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions of the 1980s. A classic example of the type of public investment which Adam Smith would have approved of was the Channel Tunnel, which in the UK was mistakenly left to private enterprise. The Channel Tunnel Company failed to make a profit for 20 years and had to be repeatedly bailed out by the taxpayer. Well, it shouldn't have been started in that way in the first place. I would argue that a public investment function has become even more needed with the financialization of the economy, in which short-term returns have become the only test for profitability. In traders' jargon, the bottom line is what we have for lunch. The dividend, though, the dividend payable to citizen shareholders would be too small, though, to provide adequate income support during the lengthy period of transition to a shorter working week. And one way of cutting through the jungle of overlapping income support schemes now available would be to provide every citizen with an unconditional basic income. Unlike the national dividend, this would be, frankly, redistributionary in aim. And remember this, the citizens' income proposal, which I support, by the way, is not intrinsically linked to automation. One can trace its philosophical root back to John Locke in the 17th century. Locke's argument was that everyone has a property right in his own labor, by which he meant not just the fruits of his own labor, the origins of the labor theory of value, but to a choice of how much to work. That's the great thing that property gives you, a choice of how much to work. And this second choice was denied by the private ownership of the means of production. And early proponents of the citizen's income, like Tom Paine, deliberately wanted to democratize the rights of ownership, this right of choice which ownership gave, by means of a basic entitlement to an income. In short, a universal basic income, by freeing people from the need to earn a living, would give them the choice, historically possessed only by a minority, of how much to work. It would be appropriate to say, it would be appropriate to pay for this by having higher marginal tax rates on income and much higher inheritance taxes. That would give it a rather nice symmetry. You would tax the minority to provide the majority with rights which they already have, the minority only have. So I think it's a nice way of doing it. Now, I come to the end because when I talk about what we should do, I think a lot of people believe that we're technologically determined, that there's nothing we can do, even if we want to stop the march of technology. I don't believe that's true. I think technology may be endogenous in our kind of society, but we certainly have some collective control over its application. I mean, it's just not true that technological innovation determine in a simple way the structure of society we have to have. We have some collective control over how much of it we want to use. We can't stop invention, but we can stop it. We can manage its application, and that's been true throughout history. But when I say collectively control, we have to think of the collectivity globally, because we're part of a global system, global supply chains. How do we actually, if we tax robots in one country, how do we stop other countries becoming robot tax havens? These problems require international solution. And what I talk about, thick institutions. We can't just leave it to the market. We can't just set up toothless bodies to sort of produce reports, and there's got to be some global governance of some kind if we're to manage the transition properly. Now, in a way, it's wrong to talk about a transition period to a shorter working week, since there's no reason why, with technical progress continuing, hours of work shouldn't fall slowly towards zero. Now, do we think that's going to happen? Keynes, as I said, envisaged a completely workless future, with all the necessary work being done by mechanical slaves. In other words, a recreation of Greek society only with machines rather than humans as slaves. Humans would all become beneficiaries of the mechanical slaves. I think this would surely be a step too far for the human race as presently constituted, psychologically and socially. Indeed, I doubt if we will ever get to this point. We will surely find means of continually recreating scarcity, violent means or other means, or developing new challenges for our own ingenuity, because on those our psychological well-being and economic arrangements depend. And in other words, as the old proverb had it, the devil will always find time for idle hands, work for idle hands. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, Lord Skidelsky, thank you very much for that fascinating and very thought-provoking speech. My name's Nina Dos Santos, anchorwoman and Europe editor at CNN in London. And as you were explained before by Deborah Greenfield, my job here will be to moderate this next 30 minutes question and answer session with the help of some technology, the kind of technology that perhaps won't take our jobs, but might take our voices a little bit. Let me introduce you to Slido. You may remember that you may have received emails before attending this session today and tomorrow, introducing you to this new technology, and I just want to show you how it works because I'd like you to start using it for the question and answers. Just to be clear, we won't be taking question and answers from the audience orally. We'll be taking it through this particular format. So if you could get out your smartphones, your tablets, they're not banned, they're certainly encouraged here for this session, and go to slido.com. If you type in hashtag ILO FOW, as in future of work, you can select today's session. And what you can do here is ask questions. You can also participate in some of the polls as well. So we'd like you to ask your questions through this format for the next half hour. You can do so anonymously. You can also vote for the most popular questions as well. I'd like to start out by encouraging to use this by putting a short poll to you before we get into the question and answers with the Director General, Lord Skidelsky. So if we could just bring up this particular poll, I want to ask the audience roughly what age group you're in. Are you of the age group 18 to 24, 25 to 34, 35 to 54, 55 plus to 64, or 65 plus? And I'm going to do this myself. We'll have the results should come up in real time. Give you a hint about my age. And I believe that about 54% of the audience at the moment is actually within the 35 to 54 age group. About 0% of you, no, 2% of you above 65, 8% of you 18 to 24, and 30% at the moment are 25 to 34, which is important for the demographics of the labour force, and we're going to be discussing that throughout the course of our speech. I'll now take my seat. And I'd like to ask the Director General, Guy Ryder, what you made of Lord Skidelsky's speech there. There were some quite significant statements that were made about the future of us humans and our relationship with work.
Well, absolutely. And the first thing I want to do, I'm sure on behalf of us all, is to thank Lord Skidelsky for a dazzling presentation, which I think had the great merit of being at the level of the enormity of the challenges and the issues before us. You know, the first thing that struck me was the centrality of technology and the possibilities of technology in your presentation, Robert. This tends to be fairly typical of the discussions we're having here at the ILO. And the image you gave, at least, is that we are. Now, there are a couple of signposts ahead of us here. You know, one is technology can take us to a sort of utopian future, liberated by the mechanical slaves, abundance, and it sounds rather nice. On the other hand, there's a lot going on in the world of work. Some of it intimately related to technological progress, which seems to be leading us to a rather dystopian future because, somewhat perversely, the liberating effects of technology are not liberating. They seem, in some respects, to be generating, contributing to, or certainly not preventing the phenomena of marginalization, failure to address poverty, in all the ways that you have described. And this raises a couple of questions in my mind, which I hope will come out in the conversation of the next 2 days. The first has to do with the agency through which we can direct things in the direction that we would all wish to go. You made reference, particularly when you referred to citizens' income, to the role of the state, the role of government, and of course, sitting in this UN room, one would hope the role of governments acting not only individually but collectively. You made reference to that as well. But if we can be a little bit more granular about this, what about the institutions of the world of work? Who is going to represent interests in the future of the world of work? You've said we cannot leave it to the market, that classical economic precepts will not take us to where we need to go. So what would, or what could, let me put it like that, the institutions and representation of interest in the future look like? I think it's a major thought that we have in this reflection. And the other point is, I think at the end you said you don't see a workless future. So how are we going to do work in the future? Are we going to see enterprises as we know them today? Are we going to see that employer-employee relationship that we know today? Are we going to see a truly labour relation, or is this going to sort of some manner dissolve in your perception into a more commercial sort of interaction, transactional interaction between providers of goods and services and those who want them? These are some of the thoughts that came out in my mind, and some of the things we're going to have to wrestle with here at the ILO. And lastly, we could have taken this title for our Future of Work initiative, the economic possibilities of our grandchildren. I mean, this is what we're looking at. What will the work possibilities of our grandchildren look like? And I think the fact that this is not a new discussion, but a very, very old one, should, I think, in the historical perspective of the achievements to date of the ILO, encourage us to think very, very carefully, and this is the bottom line of the conversation and initiative of the ILO, of where this institution should be directing its efforts in the future. And any thoughts that Lord Skidelsky would have about that would be extremely instructive. But many, many thanks for getting our meeting off to a wonderful start.
Lord Skidelsky, do you want to respond to those points now, and then we'll take some questions, 3 questions from the key stakeholders, government, employers, and also employees in a moment.
Well, I have one comment. Why not change the title of ILO to ILLO, International Labour and Leisure Organization?
That says it all.
Presumably that's not on the cards. Would you like to respond to some of the points, Lord Skidelsky?
No, I'd love to hear what the audience think.
Let's start taking some questions. And now, with the exception of Slido, for many of the audience, we will be taking 3 oral questions from, as I mentioned before, the key stakeholders, a representative from government, from the world of work, and also from the employers. So let me start out with those. I'd like to ask the Deputy Secretary for the Department of Employment of Australia, Sandra Parker, to put her question forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question based on your presentation. The question I have. Sorry.
Could you lean closer to the microphone, I believe? Thank you.
Yep.
Is that working? Thank you. Question based on the presentation. You talked about basic income and a range of taxation mechanisms, potential redistribution. A question I have is, how do you expect the future of work in that context to impact... sorry, let me change that. The question I have is around the ageing population and what the impact of the ageing population may be to some of the proposals that you had in your presentation, some of the options. So by that I mean, you know, where you are looking at perhaps redistributing wealth, what does the impact of the ageing population have on that?
Should I respond to that immediately?
Yes, please do.
Well, only I'll try to keep my answers brief. First of all, I mean, aging population means that as things are now structured, an increasing proportion of people's lives will be spent non-working. And in fact, traditionally, that's been sort of doing very, very little. But, you know, the amount of, you know, old age activities, elderly retiree activities has grown, it's expanded. And people do fill up, you know, manage to live pretty full lives, even though they don't have to work for a living. I mean, one of the things that an aging population will require is we have to re-examine our whole structure of pensions. If people live for 30 years after they give up work, or 30 or more years, this is an entirely different situation from when old age pensions were first devised. And you know, how you pay for them then becomes extremely important and extremely problematic, as the fund for paying for them shrinks relative to the number of people who have to receive pensions. You have to redo, either people have to be allowed to work longer, or we have to make bigger contributions from those who are now in work, and some mixture of the two. That's the first implication. The second implication is the question of looking after, caring for people who will experience worse health towards the end of their lives than earlier, and then whether you know, a whole new area of work can be created in the caring professions, whether these will need to expand and will have to expand. I think they will. I mean, of course, that will be a whole new source of work, often fulfilling work. But we must avoid thinking, falling into the trap of thinking that this will be a very agreeable thing for a lot of people to do. I mean, we often say, well, looking after the aged, isn't that the most fulfilling thing for people to think of if they don't have to earn their living in other ways? No, that's not true. I think even in families, looking after aged parents and relatives can be quite a burden and not something people, they do it because members of the family. That's a duty, but for strangers it may not be something that people long to do. So I think we must be careful about when we talk about creating new kinds of jobs which will be fulfilling to people. We mustn't automatically link that with caring for the aged. I mean, that's the only thing I'd say.
Let's take another question this time from Mr. Jørgen Hornist of Denmark, who's the Vice Chairman of the Employers Governing Body. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The changes to the world of work will be dramatic, even though we do not have a clear indication to the extent and the nature of these changes. I hope that the Future Work Initiative taken by the ILO will in the end offer specific guidelines to governments, to employers, and to trade unions on where and on what to focus in order to meet the challenges as a result of the changes to take place. That's my hope. My question is, how can we avoid that the Future of Work Initiative turns into a defense and protect the status quo and then taking a position on the difficult and painful reforms that we will be facing. In my view, we must deal with the challenges and also with the opportunities offered in the future. So how can we focus on what can be achieved rather than what should we avoid to discuss? Thank you.
Guy Ryder, this is all about, as you mentioned before, making sure that the conversation isn't entirely defensive and binary.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is it's a pity, I mean, it's a great shame that in many countries, especially those heavily dominated by neoclassical forms of labour organisation, the trade unions have actually ceased to be a partner. I mean, I think when the ILO was set up, as you mentioned, one thought of a tripartite system, you know, government, employers, labour, trade unions, as negotiating their future in some way on rough terms of parity. But at any rate, as partners, now one of the pillars of this tripod is no longer there, or it's there in very, very weakened form. And that was a deliberate aim of the Reagan-Thatcher reforms, of course, is to dismantle the trade union movement. So how do you give labour organisations an input, in other words, into the future of work, is a big problem. And I don't know what the solution is in the Anglo-American type of country. Secondly, how do you prevent automation from leading to simple job protection, you know, job protection mentality? Well, I think one crucial requirement is to guarantee that job losses will not lead to income losses. I mean, I think that's the crucial thing that social policy has to achieve. It's not a complete answer, because people don't actually want to be paid for doing nothing. But it's an essential answer, and it should be an automatic consequence of increasing productivity, but it isn't an automatic consequence, because the people who create the machines and own them will reap most of the profit from them. So that's why redistribution is necessary. Where is the political support for redistribution to come from? I mean, will there be enough potential losers from automation to insist that either minimum wages are raised or that there are proper redistributionist policies? In a global economy, it's very, very hard to have a redistribution in one country, because then capital goes to another country where there isn't such a policy. So again, you have to have some international agreement. That's why the European Union is potentially so important in all this. And it's such a pity that Britain is no longer
Still at the moment.
in it.
And we're all three Brits on the stage. How apt. Guy Ryder, as you were saying.
Very briefly, if I can just add a couple of comments. I think in answer to Jürgen Renes's question, the best way to stop this being a defensive, reactive initiative is to give people incentives to join in building something different. There are situations in which being defensive is entirely rational, unfortunately. And this is about common purpose. Lord Skidelsky, this is still a house where unions, employers and governments do sit together to try to create the future. It's why, by the way, the ILO is the right place, I think, for this initiative to happen. But it seems to me that we have to create, and this has to be at the beginning, not at the end of our initiative, a common commitment about what the objective of this initiative is. That means giving people a stake in it. That means, I think, committing to the types of partnership which may have fallen out of fashion in the 1980s and beyond, but which, in the retrospective of history, which is rather easier than looking to the future, has proven its worth. So it's about common purpose and those century-old values of which the founders of the ILO spoke, which is about social justice, which is about inclusion, which is about the preservation of peace through giving people a stake in the future. And our times today speak very much to those imperatives.
I just one last comment. The ILO was created in a particular phase in human history. I think it was in the 20s it started.
1919, yeah.
1919, had terrible war, and of course people wanted to build a better world. And then you had the Keynesian Revolution, which came on top of the Second World War, when, you know, social democracy was the name of the game, actually, for most of the Western world. And then you have this sort of, you know, reaction and a return in many respects to what people have called the new feudalism, or neo-feudalism. Anyway, a return to the conditions of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Look at the income inequality. You know, it's reached the point now, exactly really where it was in terms of the ownership of wealth by a very small minority, what it was in the late 19th century. You have these two peaks, 1900 and 2000, and they're in the same place. And you have in the middle, you have some compression, but then it starts again. So I think how an organization like the ILO, I think my microphone has gone off, maybe it's still there, how an organization like the ILO can still be relevant to the world which we now have is a big problem for the ILO.
Yep.
Let me just remind people in the audience that if you're having trouble hearing, you can of course use their earphones that near your seats to hear clearly. And we're going to come to the Slido questions in a second. Please remember that there are people around the room who you can ask for assistance on that. I want to take one final question from one of the stakeholders that Guy Ryder was referring to there, the workers there. Jean-Luc Kortebeek of Belgium is the chairperson of the governing body for workers. Thank you.
Jean-Luc Kortebeek, president of the workers group. So thank you a lot for this interesting analysis and also the preview of the future with some alternatives. And we spoke already, and you spoke already about this, and also Director General and my colleague Jörn. We had a specific format in the beginning of the ILO, and we have this specific format. It's about tripartism, it's about dialogue, it's about collective bargaining, it's about the standards. These are our tools, and this is the format we work with. And then, of course, we were confronted with the Washington Consensus, with the globalization, and with the mantra, and also the new recession, with the mantra of less rules or better. No regulation, please. It will go better. And then the question is, what can be? We have now already a new title for the ILO, ILO, and then the question is, what can be the role? And don't be too polite because you're the keynote speaker for the ILO, but what can be the format in the future? Because you spoke already about the problems of unions. It's not easy to organize at this moment, but look to the governments at this moment and the problems of political parties and politics in general. Look about Brexit and what's happening in the world everywhere. And look about how employers' organizations have not easy or not living in an easy time with the multinationals and the global supply chains and so on. So if you look to the tri-parties, we have all very difficult at this moment. What could be the format for the future?
Well, you were very right to mention democracy, because democracy is another casualty, really, of globalization and many of the things that have happened since the 1980s. We retain the forms of democracy, but we've lost a lot of the substance, because actually policy is made by an international oligarchy of financiers and their political, colleagues, and the democracy doesn't really have a voice, and that's really why there's been so much what you might call populist protest. It started in Seattle in 1999 with the anti-globalization protests. And then it's morphed into forms of popular protest since the recession as well. You have the various protests, 2011, Occupy, and all. I mean, these are protests against an unaccountable rule by an oligarchy, global oligarchy, actually. In Europe, you have, the protests against the Brussels, and there's a feeling that democracy is just another of the casualties, that society is being made for banks rather than banks serving society. I mean, that kind of view of the matter, and there's a lot in it. I think there's a lot in it. So how can the top be reconnected to the bottom? How can the top be made accountable again, accountable for what it does, rather than just say, we're doing the best for you. You trust us, and we're doing the best. So you trust them, and you get a world financial crash in 2008, 2009. So you can't just trust that they know better, and that their interests are the same as your interests. That is a big political problem, and its only way you can solve it is by some form of political action and political disruption. I mean, something like that's got to happen. Otherwise, you're not getting there. So I think that's the main thought in reply to your question. I don't know the answer. I sometimes feel I'd like to be 18 or 19 again, and then I could have feel that everything is possible.
But you may be worried about your work future if you're 18 or 19 with the way youth unemployment is going in many countries around the world.
That's a contrary pull.
Now, I'm conscious of time here, and I want to make sure I get the questions in. Thank you very much to so many of you who are using this new technology. And a lot of you have voted for some of the questions, and the most popular one is one we haven't tackled yet. It is the role of women and unpaid work by women. So I'm going to ask the question that Alex Paling in the audience has kindly asked. Why is unpaid work, such as that in the household primarily done by women, still being ignored and only included in the definition of work at the tripartite table? Why is it being included in the definition of work in the tripartite table?
Is that you? Would you like to answer that? I have a thought on it, but you do probably. I mean, all our social security systems have been based on patriarchy. I mean, women's work has been considered traditionally part of a man's earning, and therefore not separately included. And of course, there have been big changes, but that attitude still persists. And I think it's, on the one hand, a lot of women have been forced back into the labor market recently, because men's income has declined, and so you now need double incomes. At the same time, we haven't worked out how to support economically a modern role for women. We haven't worked out the economic arrangements for doing this. And I agree, it's something I didn't talk about, but I hope you will talk about it in the next couple of days.
Well, I think I need the microphone too. Thank you. Well, I think the whole question of women and work, by the way, which is the subject of another of our centenary initiatives, deserves to be centre stage in this discussion, and must be centre stage in this discussion as well. I think we're all painfully aware of the all-pervading inequalities that continue to characterise the world of work. Levels of women's participation, as we tend to calculate them in the workforce, 26 percentage points difference worldwide. Gender pay gap in excess of 20%, and not really showing signs of narrowing in any unambiguous way. We're all aware of those. Now, what I think we are beginning to address, belatedly but encouragingly, are those areas of work which are not generally considered to be work in the terms of national income accounting, monetization, and the rest of it. Care being one example. I'd mention domestic work as well as being another example. And by the way, in the major survey work done by the ILO on World Women's Day, International Women's Day, in March, we showed very, very clearly through an unprecedented survey of women in 142 countries that the biggest obstacle in the view of women to their progress in the world of work is a reconciliation of professional and private responsibilities. I wouldn't say family responsibilities, but more widely stated. The care economy, for all the reasons that have been outlined already by Lord Skidelsky, has to figure increasingly in our work at the ILO, and it will do so. I have one major worry about it. The care economy is seen, along with the green economy, as one of the hopeful sources of employment in the future, sort of an encouraging thing. There are two things which always come to mind when I hear that note of optimism. One is there are massive care needs today. They're not giving rise to the type of employment, they're giving rise to crisis. For the two Brits sitting before you on this platform, we know the crisis, or the three Brits, I don't know. We know the crisis of care in economic terms in our own country. The need does not give rise to the employment necessarily. And second, let's be very, very careful that by emphasizing the role and the potential of the care economy, we don't actually unwittingly reinforce gender segregation of the labour market and say, well, this is a great place women can work. This is a great place where people can work. I have to be very, very careful about that.
I want to take one more question from...
Could I just make one comment? Not comment, it's really something... Are there any really good international surveys about people's attitudes to work? We constantly talk about people, you know, what people might think about work. Would you prefer to work less? Would you prefer to work less with a lower income? Would you prefer to work less with the same income? What sort of work would you prefer to do that you're not doing at the moment? I mean, this kind of survey would give us really a factual basis for our discussion. I've searched and I find bits and pieces. Is it something the ILO could do, or at least direct me to? Sorry to...
The answer is on women at work, we've just done a piece, but more generically, I think it is something that we need to, and the ILO certainly can take a lead on.
Great, so one commitment in the first session already. Let's quickly take one final question, and all of these questions will be coming throughout the course of the day. I'm sure that during the coffee breaks you'll have a chance to talk about these points. We haven't talked about the difference between the developing world and the developed world much yet. And I'm very conscious about this. So Veronica Escudero in the audience has asked, should we start thinking of a world in which social security is based on a universal, well, to the questions of change, but let's take another one before about the emerging economies. As you can see, what is the future of work going to be in developing and emerging economies? And I'd also like to ask our two panelists for a final thought on that second question I was talking about before. Should we start thinking of a world in which social security is based on universal basic income? Because basically there's not enough jobs. And that is also relevant to the difference between the developing world and developed world, Guy Ryder.
May I take that second point first? And it was fascinating to hear what Lord Skidelsky said about the citizen income and its different varieties. I think this question is one of the central issues that we will be addressing, and the Global Commission on the Future of Work will be addressing. In the preliminary exchanges we've had on the notion of universal basic incomes, I've come across one very interesting reaction, which I hadn't expected, but which I think will figure quite large in the future discussions. It is that by embracing the notion of universal basic income, in some way, we are giving up on work. We are saying work will not suffice. And that seems to me to engender, in a way which I'm not sure is entirely rational, a moral panic, which may have to do with the notion of the rational economic actor or the insatiable economic actor, and it may have to do with simple economic constraints. But I find that it generates a real negative reaction. This cannot be done. This is the end of something. We're giving up on things which are too important. And I can't really, in the time available, do much more than underline what you've said, Nina, about the importance of making this initiative here at the ILO on the future of work, an initiative which addresses the realities of all 187 member states. You know, the danger is that we extrapolate what is going on in what we have habitually called the most advanced economies and extrapolate those into the future. But to just sort of put it in a nutshell, I always say this is a debate that has to be about, has to make sense not only in Silicon Valley, but in the Nile Valley as well. And we haven't really embraced that universality of coverage this morning. But I hope as our discussions here unfold, we will take that dimension in. It's, of course, an enormous challenge as well.
Yes, of course, what you say is underlined. I mean, for example, the Swiss referendum recently on universal basic income, citizens' income, which was rejected quite heavily by 25 to 75, something like that. That a universal income is basically giving up on work. In fact, we've partially given up on work already. People don't realize that the proportion of jobs that are now subsidized by the government, private sector jobs, through some form of income support scheme. I think in the UK, about 12% of jobs are actually they're subsidized by the government. This is not in the public sector, this is in the private sector. Without that subsidy, those people would only be able to be employed at a sort of semi-starvation wages, and actually there'd then be much higher unemployment. The problem of linking the developing and developed world is this. Technology is universal, but standards of living are still hugely different. In other words, the automation is now a free good. It can spread everywhere. I mean, China is automating a lot of its production, and that's true of many countries, especially when foreign firms go in. And they want to cut costs even more. So how do you? If you think of automation without abundance, but automation being done in very poor countries where labor is still plentiful, cheap labor, you have a much bigger problem of adaptation. But what's to slow it down in those countries? I think it's very, very hard to think of a universal basic income which includes all the poor of the world as well as the rich. Because one of the arguments against basic income has always been we can't afford it. And I mean, the poorer countries can less afford it than the rich. The rich countries could afford it. Poor countries find, but still they have the same problem. I don't know how you deal with it. Something to talk about, think about.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Lord Skidelsky, Guy Ryder, thank you very much, Director General. We're going to take a half an hour coffee break. Just to update you, obviously, as you probably noticed, the session started about 15 minutes later, so we'd ask you to come back at 11:15 for the first working session, which will be on work and society. Thank you very much.